All right, good morning, everyone. The class size doubled. That's good. Word got out. Good to see you all. Good to be back. And so we're going to be in class 2 of our series on As It Is Written, an introduction to the Old Testament and the New. Next week will be our Mission Sunday, so we'll have a Sunday school class, but it'll be Hardy Reynolds from RUF at University of Central Florida. Week after that, we will continue our series. And after that, we're actually going to have another missionary here. So it's going to be a little choppy through the end of the year. And so actually, I've updated the whole schedule. We're now going to be carrying into January with some of the changes to the schedule, but that'll be all right. As with last week, we don't have handouts. We're going to do the PowerPoint on the screen. Hopefully, you can see that sufficiently. And we are also Zooming, although I don't think anyone's on right now. But you'll, if you're interested, the recordings are online. And you can find your way to that from the website. So why don't I pray for us, and we will begin with class 2. Lord, we thank you for the chance to gather together and to grow in our knowledge of your word. We pray that you would use this series and this morning to bless your people as we unfold the riches of your word and how the Old Testament and New Testament inform each other, and help us to develop good instincts as Bible readers to see your hand in this. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so next slide. A little bit of a recap from last week for many of you who weren't here. The theme of this series is understanding how the New Testament engages with the Old Testament. And last week, I won't recap everything because we don't have a whole bunch of time. But one of the things I talked about last week is the importance of the Old Testament to the New Testament. So if you were here last week, what are some of the ways that we saw last week the New Testament makes use of the Old? Why is this an important topic? And so on. Only a third of you were here last week, so I'm relying on you already recalling some of this. Isaac, what did you learn last week? Okay, fair enough. Good. What are some of the reasons why the Old Testament is important to the New Testament? Exactly. Now, estimates differ on this, but at least something like 400, if not certainly more, quotations or allusions to the Old Testament in the New. And in fact, the very first verse of Matthew, so as soon as you open the New Testament, you're already in the Old Testament when it talks about not only a genealogy, which is echoing Genesis and Chronicles, but also reference to David and then Abraham. But then at the end of the New Testament, particularly in Revelation chapter 22, you have Jesus alluding to Isaiah and so forth. Isaac. Good. That was the other thing we talked about. Paul in particular says the Old Testament was written for us and for our instruction and so forth. And so it's an important topic. To make any sense of the New Testament, you have to make some sense of the Old Testament, which is a bit surprising, particularly in an era where there's a kind of neo-Marcionism. Marcion was an ancient church heretic who says, let's cut off the Old Testament, doesn't matter. And that is kind of in the water these days in the modern church. It has been for a long time. We're going to try to correct that tendency to downplay the Old Testament. And based on Luke 24, Jesus' parting words before he ascends in the Gospel of Luke, he says, this is what the law, the prophets, and the writings were all about, as it is written. And then he talks about the Christ and his suffering and resurrection. He talks about salvation or repentance for the forgiveness of sins, which is the gospel, and how that is to be proclaimed to all nations. So he gives us 3 themes that he says are the summation of the Old Testament: the gospel, Jesus himself, and the church. And so the back half of this whole series is going to be probing that further to actually prove that out, to show how we see the Old Testament shape our understanding of the gospel, which is a bit surprising, again, if you think of Old Testament bad, Old Testament law, New Testament gospel. It's going to be surprising to say, actually, Old Testament gospel. And that is going to be a pretty important theme that we'll probe. Also, of course, the more common thing you are aware of is the Old Testament pointing to Jesus. So that's where we like to camp out. But also the Old Testament pointing to the church in numerous ways. Our own identity is framed in terms of the Old Testament. Okay, next slide. Today and the next class, we're going to be building our tools. In particular, what should you do when let's say you're leading a Bible study, let's say you are reading the Bible yourself, and you see a bunch of Old Testament quotations, or it's like, oh, wait a second, that sounds kind of familiar. What should I do with that? And so today we're going to start the task of building our tool set. We're not going to be able to finish it today. We'll finish it next go around. And what should we do? Next slide. What should we do when we come across an Old Testament use of, a New Testament use of the Old? So this is where, and if you've ever done any studies in this, I know a few folks have, this is often where books on this topic get very bogged down. Even some of the best books on the topic of how do I go about understanding the New Testament use of the Old is precisely at this point where it starts to get confusing. And in fact, the best book on the topic by a professor at Westminster, on page 1, he gets into this stuff. Next slide. Where all of a sudden you're talking about Gezerah Shavah, and you're like, what is that? Or rabbinic midrash, what is that even talking about? Pesher exegesis, metalepsis, and Kal Vahomer, and you're like, I don't know, is that English? And no, it's not actually. And so what I'm going to try to do is keep things very simple, because I think most of the treatments of this are way too complicated, and it's not something that even most pastors use, let alone most laypersons in terms of a particular method of what should I do. In fact, the best book on the topic has 9 steps that you're supposed to go through involving these things, and within 5 minutes, you're like, I'm completely lost. And so I'm going to try to give you a much simpler, and it may seem like it's too simple, but any good tool, like a hammer, there's a kind of elegance in simplicity. And the main thing I want you to be able to do is actually do this, as opposed to get lost in the jargon, get lost in the complexities. And you notice my little, if you maybe, yeah, that's a very COVID relevant dude with he's got a mask and a face mask on. Okay, I'm gonna get, so as I mentioned, I want this set of tools for you to be equipped with, to be simple enough to actually use, next slide. To be robust enough to help you stay on track. So you don't want it to be too simple. The simplest tool is just to ignore the use of the Old Testament, just move on and keep talking about John or Romans or what have you. So the tool set needs to be good enough to keep you on track, to keep you from making blunders. And then also it's scalable or adjustable. So if you are a Bible nerd and you got some time on your hands, you can go really deep. If you're trying to prepare for your community group that's meeting in 17 minutes and people are about to show up at your house, you can do it a lot faster. And so you can sort of scale this up based on the time you have and the experience you have. If you know the biblical languages, you can go deep on this. If you don't, then you can stick with English and you'll be fine. So that's the guiding principle behind this. And so I'm going to give you 3 steps. Next slide. 3 steps. And some of this may seem a little cute, but it's not meant to be cute. The first step is going to be identify the passage. And we're going to spend most of our time on that today. And that's actually a non-trivial step. Sometimes it's easier than others. And we're going to use an example here in a minute to go through this. The second step is double-clicking on the Old Testament. Now, I'm not trying to be cute or too hip with that, because I don't do we even double-click anymore. I guess we like tap and hit zoom. But the idea there is you find the Old Testament passage that that's being used by Matthew, for instance, and you double-click on it to sort of expand the window to drill in on that passage. That's all I'm going to try to get into, and I'm going to give you some ideas behind that. And then listen to the remix. And again, I'm not trying to be cute there. I think the remix might be the best metaphor to understand what the New Testament is doing with the Old Testament. But that's going to be for next time. To understand the remix is where it's probably the hardest question that we have to grapple with. What exactly are they doing when they use Isaiah or Hosea or Deuteronomy? And I'm going to try to present to you a metaphor related to a remix. If you know music, you know what that is. And how a remix both has continuity with its source material, is not a new song, but also discontinuity because it's a remix. There's change. There's new light that's being brought to it, a new sensibility and new kind of ways. Oh, wait, I see this in a different light now. So we're going to try to give you some sort of, keep you in the fairway how to understand that remix. So 3 steps. We're going to basically do 1.5 today with the time that we have. So the passage we're going to use, if we go to the next slide, is Luke 19:45 through 47. Would someone be willing to, there we go. It's like the Star Wars thing, sort of just slowly goes up the screen. Would someone be willing to read this for us, and then we can understand the context? I'll be happy to. And he entered the temple and began to, it's because of the mask thing, it's okay. He entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And he was teaching daily in the temple. All right, so what's going on in the passage? Where are we in Luke's gospel? All right, Jerusalem, Jesus has entered what? Gone into the temple. And is it a nice sort of happy clappy RUF with some Hillsong music and it's all nice and wonderful? Yeah, so Luke gives us a pretty condensed account. You get more details in some of the other Gospels where he's knocking over tables, he makes a whip, he drives them out, and so forth. So it's a pretty condensed account here in Luke, but he is not pleased with what he finds when he goes into the temple. And this is kicking off that final week of his life where he's teaching in the temple, he's picking fights with the Pharisees, they're picking fights with him, they're conniving against him, he teaches some parables, goes out on the Mount of Olives, presents his big eschatological discourse, and then his betrayal and trial begins. And so we just have 3 verses in Luke on this scene where he goes into the temple. Now, for our purposes, why do we know that we need to pay attention? What signals that we need to pay attention here? He says it is written. So our first step is what? Our first step when you're reading the New Testament, let's say you're studying Luke, what is the first step that I gave you? No, the first step is identify the passage. We'll get to double clicking. So next slide, Zach. See, the answer was on the next slide. Step 1, identify the passage. Now, how are you going to go about identifying whenever you read, don't go to the next slide yet. I'll have it up on my screen. How do you go about identifying the use of an Old Testament passage or snippet in the New Testament? What are some of the things you have at your disposal to sort this out? Yeah, so maybe you have cross-references in your Bible. Not all do. In fact, most King James tradition Bibles don't have these. And New King James sometimes do, depending on the study Bible you have. But a lot of the more modern translations do have notes. And they're like super small font and so forth. So you can use those. What else can tip you off? Or help guide you to figure out. Okay, sometimes you have quotation marks. And we'll see that here in a minute. Where they explicitly tell you this is a quotation. Although, of course, in the ancient world, they didn't use quotation marks this way. But in our English Bibles, we have them. What else could you use if you're trying to figure this out? Not only the cross-references, but maybe your study Bible will help you out. Let's say you got the Reformation Study Bible or something like that. They may say, oh, by the way, this is from Zechariah 9:9, or this is from wherever. And then if you really have some time on your hands, and if it's really obscure, perhaps, some commentaries might help you as well. So you can share the next slide then, Zach. There we go. All right, quotation marks can help you. Footnotes for cross-references can help you. And you have those both in apps, but also in printed Bibles. You tap on the verse in an app, and usually it'll show you, oh, this is from wherever. And so generally speaking, this isn't that hard of a process, but it can get a bit complex. So next slide, Zach. What I've done here is I've put this same verse. On the left side is the ESV, and this is particularly the thin line version. I didn't realize this, but there's actually 2 different versions of the ESV. There's the short version, or the more, the less robust one. And then if you buy the big honking one, you're going to have more stuff. And then on the right, you see the NIV. So take a second on your own and read the 2 versions and point out. Now, there's going to be some different ways they phrase things. But in terms of the quotation here, make some observations as to what you find. Comparing the ESV, which I think many of us have, versus the NIV, which probably everyone else has. The 2 most popular at the present, other than King James. Where are they similar? Where are they different? Caleb. Interesting. Now, so in the prior one, my house shall be a house of prayer. Slight difference in verb there. My house will be a house of prayer on the NIV side. We'll get to that kind of stuff down the road. But you notice that both of those clauses are in enclosed within what kind of punctuation marks? Quotation marks. Both of those are set off as quotes. And if you're reading the ESV, what's the impression? He says, it is written, comma, quotation mark, my house shall be a house of prayer. But notice, close quote, but you have made it a den of robbers, and that's it. So if you're reading the ESV thin line edition, and by the way, same with the regular edition, you might not expect any other Old Testament quotes, right? You see, because they're not signaled for you. If you're reading the NIV, though, what do you see? You have 2 sets of quotations. Both of them have it, so you can go to the next slide, Zach. Both of them have it is written. And by the way, Zach, if you click on this, I don't know if you can, but it has a little area that will make it where you don't have to slide. I know. Well, this is why you're our intern. Um, no, it's because he's gifted at these things. Anyway, scratch that from the audio recording. Okay, so both of them have an "it is written," so that helps. That signals some things. And then next slide. But you have a difference in the quotation marks for those who haven't yet seen that. You see one phrase is quoted in the ESV, but two in the NIV. So the point of this is sometimes you may have to look at multiple translations. They don't always do the same thing. Now, go to the next slide. To make matters even more confusing, they don't necessarily do the same thing in terms of telling you where this is from. So if you have like the thin line edition of the ESV, because it only marks off one quotation, it tells you it's from Isaiah 56:7. And that is also true in the RSV and the Lexham Bible. But if you look at the NIV footnotes, it says, okay, one is from Isaiah 56:7. The other one is from Jeremiah 7:11. And that's what you'll see in the ASV, the CSB, and the NET Bible. Now, it's worth pointing out that if you get the bigger ESV, which will be most of your study Bibles and that kind of thing, they still don't include den of robbers in quotation marks, but they do mention the Jeremiah passage. They just don't mark it off as a quotation. Point of this is what? It's not always easy to identify. Sometimes it is, but sometimes you have to do a bit more work. Either way, this is part of the process. Spend some time trying to figure out, okay, what's being used? Where's it from? That's the first part of the battle. Questions on that? This is a pretty good example to show you that it's not always a slam dunk. Sometimes you have to do some work to go and sort this all out. If you're only using the thin line ESV, you would never know that Jeremiah is there. But if you're using the NIV, it's blatantly obvious that the Jeremiah passage is there. Becky. I don't know, actually. And this isn't meant to sort of rain on your ESV parade. I'm not really sure why they don't identify the Jeremiah one. It's bizarre to me. Because we'll see in a minute, the wording is very, very close. And so there's no reason why they shouldn't. It shows you, though, that because the ancient manuscripts don't have quotation marks, nor do they have footnotes, there is an editorial judgment that goes into this. And that's just something for you to be aware of. This is why you get paid the big bucks to do this. Because it's not always, usually it's straightforward, but sometimes not. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Once you've identified a use of the Old Testament, the next step in the process is to sort out how is it being used. And there's a handful of different labels that people use for this. I'm going to give you three that I find to be the simplest and clearest. The first is a citation. The second is quotation. And the third is allusion. Let's talk about a citation. A citation is generally word for word, but it includes something that tells you they're quoting. So what are some examples of that? It is written. That's what we saw in the Luke passage. So the Luke one would be introduced as a citation, like you're footnoting something as so-and-so said, right, in a book they wrote or what have you. So that's the citation. I'll give you some more examples of that in a minute. The second, which is very similar, but is worth distinguishing, is a quotation. A quotation is whenever it is generally verbatim, usually it's going to match pretty closely in the wording and so forth, but it's not going to have an introductory formula. That's what we call those things. It's not going to say, as it has been written in Isaiah, or this took place to fulfill what was written in Jeremiah. It doesn't have that. It just quotes it, and you don't necessarily know. They're not signaling that to you. And then the last thing would be an allusion. This is going to be snippets, or maybe some call these echoes, where you have just a little bit to remind you of an Old Testament passage. But if you're not paying attention, or if you didn't grow up in Sunday school, you might not even know what's going on. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that as well. Now, scholars differ on the labels here, but I think these three cover the waterfront. And I'm going to give you some examples and talk about why this matters. So let's go to the next slide. As a reminder, a citation uses an introductory formula. They're explicitly telling you they're doing this. And there's something like 230 of these in the New Testament. It's by far the biggest category, depending how you count it. And so here's a few examples. As it is written, the law also says, as David said, this is to fulfill what is written somewhere. And if you've read Hebrews recently, what does the author of Hebrews do? Which gives us all a sense of comfort. Because what does Hebrews do? Yeah, Hebrews is like, well, somebody said this somewhere. And, Mark and Matthew and Paul, they're always like, oh, this is from Isaiah, or this is from Joel. The nice thing about Hebrews, which is arguably the most sophisticated book in the New Testament, and it may be because it could have been derived from a sermon, but either way, he's like, well, someone said something. Which if you've ever been like, I know that's in the Bible, and it's probably from the Gospels, but I can't remember exactly where, then you're in good company. So people are like, oh, where's this from? I'm like, Paul-ish, maybe Philippians. I don't know. I mean, I'm a professional technically, and sometimes I don't know. So these are citations, and there's a whole bunch of these, a bunch of different ways these can be phrased. Next slide. A quotation is generally going to be a pretty decent sized fragment of, some sort of clause or more than one clause, but it's not going to be signaled. And so here's a good example. This is from Romans 9. If you scroll down just a bit more, Paul says, not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, but through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Now, what do you notice is missing here? He doesn't say, but as it is written. He does that a lot elsewhere in Romans, but in this particular case, he doesn't. He just introduced, this is a verbatim quotation of Genesis 21:12, which you'll see it. But he doesn't tell you that he's quoting anything. You just kind of have to know that he is. Now, in this case, the ESV helps you by putting it in quotation marks, but there aren't actually quotation marks there, nor does he tell you that he's quoting anything. So it's a very different way of doing things. And then lastly, an allusion. Here's a good example. Next slide. This is John 1:51. This is from Jesus saying, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, this is also from the ESV. What is absent? What does it not have? What does Jesus not say? He doesn't say as it is written, nor in this version or any version do you have quotation marks. But what is this from? This is Jacob's ladder. And if you've read your Bible, you know this is Jacob's ladder. And so it produces a very different effect here, and it's being remixed in a certain way because he's applying it to the Son of Man. This is almost verbatim from Genesis 28, but it's much more fragmentary. It's therefore an allusion where it's like echoing something, but it's using it in a different way. And we'll spend some time getting into that. Now, why might you use one of these methods versus another? So next slide back. Why do a citation versus just a quotation with no tipping the hand that you're quoting something versus an allusion? I think a lot of folks don't reflect on this, but this actually, it's important to pause and say, okay, why did Paul do it this way? Because he had other options. He could have said, as it is written in Genesis, but he chose not to. And anytime you make a choice, there's a motivation behind that choice. And so whenever you directly cite something and you're like, look, as God said to Moses by the Spirit or whatever, what effect does that produce? Why might you do it that way? Something like 200 times in the New Testament, they do it this way. Okay, audience. Maybe the audience is more familiar than others might be. And they're like, oh yeah, maybe that's what's going on. Okay, authority. Generally speaking, when you directly cite something and you say that you're citing it, it's an appeal to authority. For instance, if someone says IRS code 213.D, I can't remember exactly, it has something to do with the tax filing. As it says, what does that do? In a business context or April 15th or July 15th this year? Yeah, it's a credible source. You can go look it up and you can say, yeah, that's what it says, and therefore you need to respond this way. It's an appeal to authority. Oftentimes there's an apologetic idea behind this, saying I'm trying to defend a particular position using a source text. As Brown versus Board said and decided, or as my boss said in the memo on this day, right? You're appealing to authority. And so we need to kind of approach, and that's what's going on when they do that. Now, what about a quotation that doesn't explicitly signal that they're drawing on the Old Testament? So for instance, if you say, like, if you're, driving around somewhere and you're lost and you're scared and you say, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. First off, what is that alluding to, or what is that quoting? This is actually a direct quotation. Had to look it up. The Wizard of Oz. She says, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. But do I say, as Dorothy saith? No, because that wouldn't make any sense. She has no authority. But what am I doing by directly taking that whole quotation and using it this way? Something everyone knows, or at least if you've watched Wizard of Oz, you know. So you can pick up on that quotation. Okay. Yeah, so basically I'm saying, okay, what I'm going through is like what Dorothy was going through. So if you know what she's going through, you can apply it to this current situation to understand what we're going through. And so that is what a quotation can do. And then if we say, look, we're crossing the Rubicon here. This is a big deal for our company. We're crossing the Rubicon. What is that? Is that a quotation? It's not quoting anything. No one ever said we're crossing the Rubicon here, but what's it alluding to? Say it again. No, not Hannibal. A little bit older than that. Caesar crossing the Rubicon. And once you cross the Rubicon, what does that mean? There's no going back. And so I'm saying, all right, I'm drawing on your knowledge of ancient history to give this meaning. So next slide, Zach. A citation is often an apologetic proof or appeal to authority. A quotation is often giving your New Testament message and Old Testament significance. And then an allusion is basically like, for those who have ears to hear, this is going to make a whole lot more sense. If you don't have ears to hear, you might not even notice it. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to do. It's like, okay, for those who actually know their Bible, they're going to get this. And those who don't, it's probably going to go over their heads. That's okay. That's part of your communication strategy. So that is step one. So how would we classify, next slide, how would you classify Luke 19:45 through 47? These are the quoted bits, or these are the referenced bits. It is written, my house should be a house of prayer, and then you have made it a den of robbers. How would you classify the first one? That would be a citation. It has a direct formula. It is written. And so Jesus here is saying, look, I'm walking into the temple and something's messed up. And the way I know it's messed up is God has said this. See how he's like, I'm quoting this to religious leaders who know what the Bible has said, and I'm bringing this down upon their heads. But the den of robbers thing is kind of interesting. Even the ESV doesn't mark it as a quotation. Some do, some don't. And so where might that fit? It could be an allusion. I would actually say it sort of straddles the line, actually, because the number of words is pretty high in terms of 3 or 4 words that match Jeremiah, but it's not nearly as marked off as the first one is. And so it's almost like, all right, if you know if you're picking up what I'm throwing down, you're understanding what I'm saying here. And if you don't, then fine. They're obviously doing something bad financially, and so if you're just hearing Jesus and you've never read Jeremiah, you might not pick up on it. But if you have, it's actually a pretty big statement that he's making. And so it operates on multiple levels here. That's what makes it so interesting. Is when he says den of robbers, if you're just there and you're just like regular dude in Jerusalem, like, oh, that's pretty mean. But yeah, I guess they have been pretty bad selling the pigeons and that kind of thing. So I can understand why he would say that. But if you know your Old Testament, if you grew up at River Oaks Church and you're going through the Gospel Project, like, oh, wow, that's what he's saying. And as we'll see, when you go and look at the passage, it's a pretty stunning claim that he's making. Okay, so the first one is a citation. Next slide. Appealing to God's authority here. And the second one, if you go to the next slide, would be probably an allusion, maybe a quotation. I don't get too bothered about necessarily always having to be precise. But I would argue, as we'll see, that this is going to produce a kind of aha moment. It's like, oh, wait a second. That's what he's saying. That's pretty messed up. It's like, that hurts, as we'll see. Okay, next slide. We're going to just dip into step 2. But any questions on step 1? Step 1 is in many respects the easiest, although sometimes not. Because, life's not always easy. But any questions on identifying? So you want to find the passage using the notes at your disposal. And then if you can, sort out, okay, as an initial guess, what are they maybe doing here? Why is it in quotations? Why does he say as it is written? How does that maybe shape the way I should think about what's going on? Again, it doesn't have to take an hour. You can do it in 3 or 4 minutes. All right, we go to step 1. All right, step 2, double click on the Old Testament. So next slide. The next step, once you've identified, okay, this is from Jeremiah and this is from Isaiah or what have you, what should you do next? Go look it up, but start with just the quoted portion or the reference portion. And you want to compare the wording between the New Testament quotation / citation / allusion and the source text. Kind of line them up. And if you have time, you could actually, go online. This is what I do. Copy the Old Testament passage, drop it in a Word document. Copy the New Testament passage, drop it in a Word document. Actually go and highlight and say, okay, here's where they're similar, here's where they're different. Now, generally speaking, next slide, Zach. Generally speaking, the wording is going to be pretty close. Now, why might that be? Theologically, why would it? Generally speaking, if Jesus is quoting Isaiah and you go look up Isaiah, generally the wording is going to be almost an exact match or pretty close. kind of a broader point, Caleb. Right? Yep. It's part of it.
Different translations. The NIV says it a little way.
Yeah, so that's when it might not be the same. But generally speaking, it's going to be pretty consistent because the textual history of the Bible is stable. That whatever they're talking about Isaiah, it's effectively the same Isaiah that we have. There could be a few variants here and there. But in general, it's going to be pretty close. And in general, they're going to quote it in a way that's very faithful to their source text. And the New Testament authors are far more accurate in their quotations than most of their contemporaries, even though it may not always be as verbatim as we have to be today. You know, today, if you're writing a research paper, what do you have to do if you're citing a journal? And you're going to actually say, as so-and-so in 2018 said, what do you have to do? It has to be word for word. You have to tell them where you got it. It's got to be perfect, right? Now, in the ancient world, that wasn't the standard, but it just so happens that the New Testament authors are, generally speaking, better at it, so to speak, in terms of verbatim accuracy than their peers. But sometimes the wording does vary. What could be some reasons for that? So one of them is English translation noise. What is the Old Testament that you have in front of you? What is it translated from into ESV, NAS, whatever, on the Old Testament side? From the Hebrew. What is the New Testament translated from? From the Greek. Do languages map perfectly to one another? If you know multiple languages, if you've ever learned Spanish or what have you, you know there's multiple ways to say the same thing. That's why the NIV and ESV and NAS don't always agree. And so sometimes a difference in wording is due to the English process, because one is coming from the Hebrew and one is coming from the Greek. There could, though, be some intentional revision. And so Mark or Matthew or John sometimes might update the grammar. They might change the verb form to make it from not a third singular, but make it a second plural or what have you. Sometimes they might rearrange the clauses and put part A here and part B here and switch the order. Sometimes they might just summarize the passage or maybe simplify it in some way. All of that is normal. That's not meant to be strange or scary. That is part of the normal process in the ancient world of quoting passages. But sometimes the biggest reason why the New Testament wording will differ from the Old Testament that you have is that a lot of the time, not always, the New Testament authors aren't using the Hebrew. In other words, they're not using the version that you are reading from via English. What are they using instead? Say it louder, loud and proud. The Septuagint. What is that, Arlen? It's actually a hard question to answer, but we won't get into that.
The Greek translation of the Hebrew.
Exactly. So after Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world, the Jewish community switched from using Hebrew and Aramaic to using Greek. This is in, call it the 250s BC, so 2.5 centuries before Jesus. And so the Septuagint became their King James. That's what they started using. It was a Greek translation of the Hebrew because most of them didn't know Hebrew anymore, much like most of us don't know Hebrew anymore. And so a lot of times the differences that you'll see are derived from that. They're using their Pew Bible as opposed to going back to the Hebrew that your ESV is using. Does that make sense? So there's a handful of reasons why the wording might vary. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. And as we'll go, we'll see, okay, sometimes there's a tweak to a clause here that really does actually matter, and let's probe what's going on there. So let's take a look at our passage before we wrap it up for today. So next slide. So as I said, copy one on one part of the page, copy the other on the other part of the page, and compare them. And in this case, even though the identification step was a bit tricky vis-a-vis the ESV versus NIV issue, the wording is pretty similar. And so this one's not too bad. So you see Isaiah 56:7, my house shall be called a house of prayer, whereas Jesus says, my house shall be a house of prayer. What's the only real difference there? Called. Not a big deal. Jesus just doesn't quote that bit of it. And then Jeremiah 7:11 has this house, which is called by my name, scroll down just a touch, become a den of robbers. So there's the den of robbers phrase, which is the same when Jesus quotes it. But what is interesting, and maybe one of the reasons why Jesus brings these two together, is that in the Greek translation that Arlen rightly pointed out, the so-called Septuagint actually says, has my house become a den of robbers, whereas the Hebrew doesn't say my house. And so actually what you see is two instances of my house, one in Isaiah, one in Jeremiah. That could be the reason why Jesus is bringing those together. even though the Hebrew of Jeremiah doesn't have my house. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. Final slide. Once you've done your wording comparison, and as we go through, we're going to see some examples where the wording is identical, nothing to worry about. If it's identical, move on. If there is a pretty big difference, then you should pause and reflect on that. So we'll see both examples as we go through. But once you have done your very preliminary study of the wording, and again, you can do this pretty quickly just by like underlining in Word or what have you. It's not meant to take forever. Then what are you going to do? You're going to study the broader context. So next time we get together, we're going to pick up here. We're actually going to go and look at Isaiah 56. We're going to look at Jeremiah 7 and figure out what on earth is going on here. And that's when some of the light bulbs are going to start to go off. You're like, oh, that's why Jesus quotes this. That's pretty fascinating. Most of us don't do this step, do we? If you're reading Luke 19, you're like, all right, let me just get to the crucifixion. Like, okay, something's going on here, a den of robbers. I know he's mad at them. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, half the time you even look at the footnotes. If you're honest, yeah, probably not. And so you're probably not necessarily in the habit of looking them up in the Old Testament. And so the big discipline that I want to reinforce is when you do that, that's when some of this meaning really starts to pop. And so we're going to pick up here next time and start talking about how do you go about studying the broader context? What do you need to be doing when you do that? Any questions so far? All right, so we're a step and a half through our process. We'll finish it up next go around, and then we will start looking at some thematic uses and go from there. So thank you. See you all next go around.